You've launched your brand new podcast and you can't wait for the world to hear all about it. But first, you have to make sure that you go through the Apple submission process. And the biggest question that comes up throughout this entire process is, of course, how long will it take Apple to approve my new podcast? Let's dig into that here today on the Podcast Accelerator with me, your host, Mark Asquith, CEO and co-founder of Rebel Base Media, the British podcasting company that makes podcasting technology platforms, including, of course, Captivate.fm, the world's only growth-oriented podcast host, where you can find out what makes Captivate such a great tool for growing your podcast by checking out the 7-day free trial at Captivate.fm. Now, we are going to talk about how long it takes Apple to approve a brand new podcast in just a few seconds. Before I do that, I, of course, want to give a big shout out to AWeber, who sponsored this show. The reason they sponsored this show is that, honestly, we've worked together for years, ever since I started in online business. So very many years ago now. Wow, I'm getting old. AWeber has been there, and as I've got to know the team over the last 10 years or so, it's become very apparent that they do business like I do business. So look, for the same reason that I believe you should use Captivate for your podcast hosting, I believe you should use AWeber for your email marketing as a podcaster. They make it so easy. They take away all the worry and the technical jargon and the know-how. So please go and check them out at markasquith.com/AWeber. So did you know that Apple Podcasts actually reviews every single podcast manually right now? Well, they do, and that's a good thing because it means that, things get properly reviewed. But it can mean that you've got to wait just a little bit for your show to be approved. And here's how it works. So what you do is, if you assume you're using Captivate, you will, of course, go ahead to your distribution section. You'll make sure that your podcast has at least one episode published. All your feed details are filled in your show settings, like you've got a good quality cover art in there that meets the specifications. You will, of course, make sure you've got categories set up, and basically you've set your show up. Then what you do, head to your distribution section, and then you click Submit to Apple Podcasts. Now, what this does is it's going to fire up something called Apple Podcasts Connect. And inside Apple Podcasts Connect, what we do is we pre-fill the URL of your RSS feed, which I talked about over on the last episode of the Podcast Accelerator. If you're wondering what an RSS feed is, go and check that last episode out. We pre-fill that for you, and you just basically go through the validation and submission process. Now, Apple Podcasts Connect is your gateway to Apple's mind when it comes to what they're doing with your podcast, okay? So as long as your show validates, which if you're on Captivate, it will, all you do is you submit that, and then that goes off to Apple. And Apple, their team, they will listen to certain parts of your show. They will check your feed, check your artwork for you, and just make sure that it's all right to go into their directory, because ultimately they're responsible for that directory. And ultimately as well, because their API powers other podcasting outlets, such as Overcast, for example, of course, they're kind of responsible for what appears in some of the other apps out there as well. So it's very important that Apple gets this right for you and spends that time looking at things. Will they move this to a digital process in the future? Who knows? But right now, they're manually approved, which can mean that getting your podcast approved in Apple Podcasts can take somewhere between 24 and 72 hours. That's the guidance. However, what I would suggest is to remember that everything is done manually. So these are real people. Now, why does that matter? Well, I've had several podcasts actually approved within just a few hours, okay? But I've also waited 4 or 5 days. Okay. And I've actually waited up to a week for my podcast to be approved by Apple. Now, there's nothing to worry about there. That doesn't mean that your show isn't fine. It doesn't mean there's anything wrong with it. All it means is that, look, maybe you submitted it over a weekend. Maybe you submitted it over a holiday period. Maybe you submitted it over Thanksgiving or Christmas or a bank holiday weekend. That's completely fine. And Apple generally are fairly good at getting things done on time when it comes to podcast approvals anyway. So very often a holiday season or a long weekend or whatever doesn't actually affect the review process. But just bear that in mind. There's no need to panic, okay? There's no need to worry about Apple taking a little bit of time. You can always log into your Apple Podcasts Connect account, and you can go ahead and you can check that, and you can make sure that everything's still in the submission process. You can also get in touch with them via that platform as well if you really, really need to. I would urge that you don't really need to until at least 3 days has passed. If 3 days has passed, maybe they're a little busy, okay? But as long as nothing's wrong with your podcast, it will get reviewed. And theoretically, as long as everything's fine with it, which it will be if you use something like Captivate for your hosting, it will get approved, okay? So like I said, it can take generally between 24 and 72 hours. As a general rule, I wouldn't suggest contacting them anywhere before 72 hours, even though I know it can be frustrating and like you've created this thing and you love this thing and it becomes very important that you get this thing out into the world. Like I said, these are real people, all right? Apple are real people. Let's give them a chance. Let's let them do their jobs. I've seen it, like I said, within 4 or 5 hours. I've had 2 or 3 shows that I've submitted that got approved within just a few hours because, who knows? I submitted it at the right time. Maybe the team was a little quieter. Maybe it was a quiet day for podcast submissions. I do not know. Okay. But don't be surprised if it does take up to that 72-hour mark. But don't worry if it takes, if it does take that, please don't worry about it. Get in touch with them if you're worried about it after that 72-hour period. All right. Let them do the job, like I said. And there's nothing you can really do to expedite this. And let's be completely honest, there's no real bloody reason to expedite it. Sure, you want to launch this thing as quickly as possible. Apple now makes it possible to go through the review process and the approval process and then publicly launch a show on Apple Podcasts after that. There's a little setting that you can use. So it's not like it used to be where Apple approved it and suddenly you were live. So if you're one of the kind of podcasters that's been taught to race for the new and noteworthy, which I still find baffling, it's one of those things that, now you can control it a little bit more because you can say, well, let's give Apple some time to approve it. And then we'll turn on the podcast in Apple Podcasts when we want to, okay? So that's a new feature they put out a few months ago, which is quite nice. Just gives us a little bit more control over our podcast. But remember, the goal of a podcast launch is to actually launch a podcast like you would a product or like you would a service, a new business, or like you'd launch as a pop star. Imagine you're a pop star and you want to launch a brand new album. You don't just say, oh, my album's here, unless you've got the audience to do it already, like Justin Bieber drop a new album and it goes crazy. Any other pop star in the world probably can't do that. You've got to go ahead and you've got to market it. So in this time where you're waiting for someone like Apple to approve it, why not use that time to market your podcast's launch, all right? Why not use that time to market your podcast's launch? So to recap, you have to submit your RSS feed to Apple Podcasts in order to get into Apple Podcast. Your show must have all the settings filled in properly in your podcast host like Captivate. It must have at least 1 episode. I recommend a trailer. Google Mark Asquith trailer format. Steal that format. Then make sure you submit it through the distribution section of something like Captivate. Many hosting platforms don't have a distribution section that's as nice as Captivate, but wherever you do host, dig around and find it. If it's Captivate, it's in the distribution section. It's dead easy to find. Go through Apple Podcasts Connect. Make sure your RSS feed is in there. We'll pre-populate that if you're on Captivate for you. Validate, submit, and sit back and wait for Apple to approve it within 24 to 72 hours. Only at that point should you really contact them and say, look, what's going on? But use that time in the meantime to market your show, market the launch, all right? If you need a hand with that, go and check out markasquith.com/grow. That's some growth tactics, some marketing tactics that you can use to market that show. So there is the question answered. How long does it take Apple Podcasts to approve my podcast? Now you have the answer. And as always, stay safe. Let me know what you can do. Look after yourselves, look after one another, and never forget, the more you expect from yourself, the more you will excel.